embezzled from them. Like that's
okay.
that's the story you want to hear. So I think it is important that if you're somebody out here podcasting and you have on guests, understand that the function of that is like you want your audience to be able to learn as much about them as possible. My podcast preparation, I don't know about you all, but like it's pretty extensive because time is great because you have time to air out the conversation, but you also have to clearly have something to talk about during that time. And you have to do a much deeper dive into the person because you may have them for 30 minutes or 40 minutes or 45 minutes, or in my case, sometimes an hour. So I am on YouTube. I usually, what I do for guests that I interview, particularly since so many of them tend to be talked about all the time, is I look at interviews they've done in the last year, the last 5 years, and the last 10 years. Just to give myself a good idea of maybe not just their evolution, but the things they were saying, how they may have changed on some stuff, or maybe it's little nuggets that they dropped back then that people forgot about that I can expand on now. So I try to watch actually a lot of the interviews that they've done. And of course, do deep dives in terms of finding profiles that are written about them and as much extensive stuff that has been done on these people so that I don't ask them the same things they've been asked 100 times, or at least if I do ask it in a different way. I always try to bring a wrinkle of something to the conversation. When I did the podcast with Kamala Harris, I mean, she's a political candidate, so she's got a ton of different positions that are all out there everywhere. And my favorite question that I asked her was, what was her favorite cuss word? You never hear politicians like we know they cuss, but I was just curious. Now everybody's gonna think I'm obsessed with cursing, but I really wanted to know, like, what was it? And so I was very happy when she told me it was the one that starts with the M and ends with an A. She didn't say ER. She said A. I was like, see, she real. She know. Another big thing that's talked about in podcasting is money. People want to know, can I make money on this podcast? So as much as you'd like to share, I'm not asking you to disclose your salary necessarily, but has podcasting for either or both of you been an additional money-making revenue venture for you?
Look, this NABJ family, I'm going to keep it a buck. This has not been lucrative for me. For me, this has been about my portfolio, right? Like it has been about owning something, like LaChina said earlier, keeping your name out there, doing the work. My team, Pure Hoops, we're working, we're growing. I have faith in those guys. And if I'm able to ride with them so we all getting big paid, then fantastic. If not, the consistency, the accountability has been important for me, and having something that I call my own, it is my podcast on my resume. You know what I'm saying? When you look me up, you see it, you find it, you Google it. I'm very proud of that. And I get it. We get to these points in our careers where you're not working for free or you got XYZ salaries. That's fine. I encourage people to have their own creed about themselves. But for me, in this instance, this was something that I wanted to do, and being recruited by these folks made it so much easier. I was like, bet, let's go.
And we need your ray of sunshine out in the world on that podcast. That's another reason why it had to happen. Podcasting has not been lucrative for me either. In fact, the little bit of money that I do make, I put back into the podcast, to our creative director, branding, social media person. So I actually don't make money off the podcast at the end of the day. And I started it with the purpose of growing the game of women's basketball. And to this day, that is still the main purpose. However, now that I'm learning more about sponsors and different things and different ways that we may be able to monetize it, I'm somewhat handcuffed because I am under ESPNW. Yep. So as far as the sale of my podcast, I don't have control over it. But I may try to scoop some people over that way.
Recruiting battle here.
I'm like, I heard that Kleenex might be interested. So, there's some strategies on deck for sure, because more than anything, like, we do live podcasts and, we'd like to do more giveaways. We want t-shirts. So it's not even all about putting the money in our pockets, but what are some other ways that we can use that money to get more marketing, get more branding, more put back into the podcast. So I don't see this as something, at least for me in the current format in which I'm podcasting, that's going to be lucrative. But I've got some ideas and, for now, I'm all good. Now, if I start to get the itch, I'm going to be working with Jemele,
Okay, so obviously, back to Jemele though, in regards to that. But Jemele, I think the thing that like is so important when you answer is like your body of work. And I would put LaChina in a similar bucket as you, but like some of the questions we're getting on the side are about why to start or who to start. Like you are Jemele Hill at this point, right? Like, and you know what I'm saying? Like, I'm proud of me, but like, I get it in terms of,
yes, you are.
But I get it in terms of like the name power, the cachet that you come with. And I totally respect that. But I think part of it is like, just start. Like in my case, you got to start and be committed and then see what happens.
Well, I have a good story to tell on that end is that, you know, as people a lot of times look at where you finish. They may look at where I am now and I'm bothered and not realize where it started. So as everybody knows, I was at ESPN for 12 years. Mike and I, my former co-host, Michael Smith, before we started His and Hers as a TV show, it was a podcast we did for free. Okay. Mm-hmm. And at ESPN, because you're under the mouse, you're under the network, you aren't allowed to get a separate income for the most part. I mean, maybe I'm sure somebody up in there has done something different and maybe it's different for them. But generally speaking, if you're on air talent, the podcasting and all the other multimedia things, that's just part of what you do. That is not a separate, okay? And even if they sell your podcast and make a bunch of money off advertising, you ain't seeing none of that money. So it doesn't really matter, right? And LaChina knows I'm telling the truth on that, right? So essentially, we started His and Hers because we got tired of people not putting us together on TV. We knew we had a special chemistry. We decided to do that. And we did the podcast for months. Well, actually, we did it for a full year before I joined Mike on the TV side. And it wasn't even His and Hers then. It was Numbers Never Lie. Mm-hmm. They changed it to His and Hers because the success of the podcast. So the podcast that I did for free, that I used to, when I had to fly back and forth to Bristol to do sports reporters and other TV shows, I'd stay an extra day just so we could take this podcast. It was truly a labor of love. We went to about 11 podcast apps because I was in Orlando and Mike was in Bristol, and we did all of that. And that eventually led to a television show. So pivot to where my career is now. There is potentially a lot of money in podcasting, but you have to start at the steps that Monica is talking about. LaChina is, I am. Now, look, you can hit lightning in a bottle, and Spotify may roll up to you and say, boom, here's a 2-year podcast deal. Do your thing, whatever. That may happen. But generally speaking, a lot of podcasters start off doing it for free, build the following, build the audience, build the consistency, and then it becomes something else. Most of the successful podcasts you see out right now, they all kind of started in a very, in its infancy, in a very free place. And so now that I'm able, yes, it did. So now that I'm able to make, a lucrative amount of money off of the podcast, it forced me to create a separate company just to handle, the podcast. If you're able to get a deal with Spotify, like it's myself, Joe Budden, Amy Schumer, it's a number of people who have a podcast deal specifically with Spotify. We're behind, not necessarily a paywall. You have to subscribe, to kind of get it, and the subscriptions are free, but it's exclusivity. So I'm exclusive to Spotify. They give me money out of the money that Spotify gives me. That's how I pay my engineer, my producer, my podcasting space. So it's become a full-fledged business, for me. And that's been an interesting turn in my career, going from working under people, for people, to working with people and employing people. Yeah. So that's that is quite a turn. And so that's how I'm able to merchandise these shirts.
Come on,
right? And able to do all that. I got you. I got both of y'all. So that's how I'm able to do that, is because it's now a full-fledged built business. So it may not start off lucrative, but it could easily potentially get that way. So I just want people to have that in mind. So the people who are like, oh, there's never any money in podcasting, depends on how you flip your situation. I want to ask you guys one more question, because we have a lot of people who have questions that we want to make sure we try to breeze through. What are some of you guys' favorite podcasts? And were there any podcasts that you looked at before you got involved with your own that kind of helped get your, kind of help get the juices going and gave you some ideas for yours? Monica, what are you listening to other than your own podcast? And LaChina and mine, of course.
I was about to say, so honest to God, when Sherrod sent this email, I was like, dope. Like, I listened to both of those. In fact, I think, Jemele, your pod with Soledad O'Brien is like one of my favorites. Like, I just love
Thank you.
how real y'all were, like how honest she was in that conversation. And of course, keeping up with women's hoops. Like, I'm always listening to LaChina / might get the call up to sub in when she's busy, which is fantastic. I think other pods, funny enough, we all love Insecure. I actually used to listen to Ball Girl Magic with Roz and Yvonne.
Yeah.
They scrapped that.
That's a good one.
One of my classmates from Georgetown is actually responsible for, Lord, the pod literally just went out. You Had Me at Black is what her infrastructure is called. And so it's a series of Black folks, just regular Black folks telling their stories. And she's actually doing a really dope series that she just launched now, which is called Natal. And it's talking about what Black women in this country go through in terms of giving birth. And then honestly, like, I just kind of pop in on pods when I hear things that are relevant. Like, definitely have teed up Woj when he's, breaking news in the NBA. When all the smoke is buzzing, like, Jemele, you were on there, you gotta check out, see what them fools up to. But in general, like, I think probably LaChina is one of the ones that I listen to regularly.
Yeah. And same here. And let me just say, my favorite part of Monica's podcast is at the end where she gives you scenarios and you have to say, are you boarding it? Is it a block? She has me on the block. Yeah, I'm like, it's really good. Like, that's my favorite segment. Of course, Jemele is fucking unbothered. Like, that's everybody.
Yes.
And also, Jemele, I'm not gonna lie, when you and your husband did this recent one, y'all had me pulling my hood snacks out of the closet. I almost took you a picture of my Frosted Flakes and Apple Jacks. I had any. But I found a reason to get hood during the coronavirus. Okay.
Yeah.
Some of my favorite podcasts are Side Hustle Pro for sure, because I feel like I always got a side hustle, and I just love that podcast. Myleik Teal has a podcast. She's the inventor of the Curl Box. I love her podcast. There's one called Relationship Advice, and I forget the host. It's a man and a woman that they're married, but I need all kinds of relationship advice.
Girl.
You know what LaChina you.
Small Doses, I love, Amanda, especially her recent one with Issa Rae. I was just like in love with. There's one called On Purpose with Jay Shetty.
Yeah, I've heard that.
Podcast with Jada Pinkett. Again, relationship centered, amazing. I really like the School of Greatness podcast, and my favorite guest on that one was Jay Will. I listen to NPR Up First almost every morning. That's my little 12-minute podcast nugget that gives me what's going on the political side of things. But my favorite podcast that I've heard to date was called The Dropout. And it's basically long form reporting on the story of Elizabeth Holmes, that whole Theranos scandal.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. I watched the movie. I think it was like a movie about that. Yeah.
Podcast is called The Dropout. You have to listen to that thing. It is legit. And I'm in love with sound. Like, that's one of my favorite things about podcasting is when you pull in the clip of somebody like actually speaking and you bring me to that moment, and they have tons of sounds from interviews and stuff in there. It's amazing.
All right. That's a lot. Well, that's definitely a good variety, because those true crime podcasts are super huge right now. Like, those are really good. What was, God, I forgot the one that was super famous that everybody, I listened to that one.
With the brothers, or the one brother that was weird?
No, it wasn't that one. I'll think of it in a second. But beyond that, Small Doses, definitely a good one. Rants and Randomness, Yvonne Orji, Lovey Ajayi, that's also a really good one. The Read, and probably one of my favorite ones, because I'm a big fan of the TV show The Office. I listen to Office Ladies with the two of the stars from The Office, Jenna Fisher and Angela. I can't remember her last name, but I always listen to that because they break down every single episode of The Office. And I listened to that before, way down in the hole, but it became even more relevant once I started doing the Wire one, because I was curious as to how the rewatch pods were. So I listened to Rewatchables, and there's a ton of course, Joe Budden's podcast as well. Right. I listen to his. talking about time, he don't care. He's like, this is gonna be 2.5 hours. He's like, damn, Joe, this a movie, this the Godfather. Like,
you got that voice. You can lay down and like, yeah, you got that voice keeps you into it. You're like, all right, Joe, what you got to say?
Okay, I sort of lied before we get to a couple of these questions. What are some tips? Because this is a question that keeps popping up. What are some tips you can give to people for how to grow their audience?
LaChina.
You can start, Monica. You start.
I'm gonna just say consistency. Like for me, we have a great editor that puts out our little visuals that go on Instagram and Twitter. Like they drop every Thursday. I'm tweeting, retweeting. Hopefully my friends get a little traction. Like this is something for me we talked about. I'm doing out of passion, and so everything is very organic. I've been proud to say, it's more than 52 now, but like I'm proud that we put out a podcast just about every week except a couple of holidays.
Just a couple of things, and this is really not my area of expertise in terms of trying to grow, but I would say a couple of things that I've noted that I think we can do better is we don't really have an email list of people, and I think that's something we could develop, because one area that we've gotten some recognition that we didn't expect is that we get quoted in a lot of articles. And so I think we do a better job of, creating a database of women's basketball media that may be interested in what our guests have to say and sending the podcast to them. It's all about making it convenient when you can. I also think email-wise, we could do a better job. Like when we have a player or coach on our podcast we used to curate like tweets and post for them. So all they had to do was copy and paste it and tweet it out or send it out to their fans. And so that's something I think the easier you make it for people, then they may be willing to get it out. The other thing is I think video clips are big, or they're huge, at least for us. And it's not necessarily, or we don't know yet if it's lending itself to more listeners, but we're getting more views sometimes on our videos than we would expect, and sometimes more than we get of our listeners. So it's like, at least people are absorbing the brand, they're hearing the name, they're watching, they're seeing some of your content, which then may invite them to go listen to the podcast, maybe not, but I just think that everyone loves video. So using that, especially now on Zoom, is something that I would suggest. And then the last part is, and we still have to work on this, is your calendar. Like our content calendar is important because of the type of podcast we have. And it's like, if you know what's happening in the world, you can kind of latch on to some larger conversations that are happening and making sure that your podcasts are scheduled accordingly. So you're either leading it to a big event or coming out of one, but really having a grasp on, where can I have the most important and impactful conversations based on what else is happening in the world, is something I think we can definitely do better at.
Yeah, I mean, all the tricks you guys mentioned are really important and helpful in growing your audience. People do tend to latch on to video clips. So for season 2 of Jemele Hill is Unbothered, we're going video now. And so people will be able to see not the interviews quite in full, because we want to make sure that you go and subscribe, but you'll get a good, healthy dose, maybe 30 or 40 minutes. And if you want to hear more, then you'll have some avenues to do that. So we have a YouTube channel that's starting, and putting the clips out on social media. I started, I have somebody who does the social media that started separate accounts for the podcast, so that can be an engagement center for fans, especially if you are asking questions. Like I have a segment on mine called This or That, where I force the guests to pick between two things. So we got a ton of engagement when I think the question was Martin or Fresh Prince. And so you put that on social media, that's just like catnip to a lot of people.
Yes.
So if you have franchise segments that can be portable, really important that you find a way to highlight those, put them on social media, and up your engagement and conversation. It may not, to LaChina's point, it may not necessarily lead to direct subscribers, but relevance is important, and you want people to be talking about the things that you're talking about on your podcast. And one day, what they might do is say, you know what, I'm gonna hit subscribe. This is just too good. Yeah. Or I'm gonna tell my friends about it, and that'll be important. It is super important to make sure that you call them assets, that you give those to the guests, definitely. So we, particularly those who have a different following, we give them to everybody, but we especially like to drill this in with people who have a different following than maybe I do, or have a humongous following in general. Like Killer Mike tweeting out the podcast was huge, or Ice Cube tweeting out the podcast we did together, that was huge. Those are ways, if you can get the guests and it doesn't really, they don't have to have millions of subscribers, but just getting them to put out your podcast is taking it to an entirely new group of people. So you have to focus on, again, what exactly is your reach. I do think events help. Like if you're able to do a live podcast somewhere where it's a lot of people and there's buzz and you can create new fans and new listeners, that is helpful as well. If it's something that's obviously, kind of within your budget, or, it could just be a big event in town. And timeliness is super important. Like obviously a lot of us are talking about Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and the tragic cases there. I'm totally going to drop the podcast I did with Ben Crump because of the conversation, because he's representing both of those. Yeah. And we had a great conversation about social injustice and all those sorts of things. So don't be afraid to take advantage of a news event. Like everybody's watching The Last Dance. If you, and you don't even need a celebrity, if you and your co-host had a great conversation about Michael Jordan or about The Last Dance, drop it, right? Don't be afraid to drop these things like during the midst of everybody's having this conversation. All right, now I'm going to get to some of the questions that we have here before we get out of here. I think this one is a really good one. I'll start with you, LaChina, and you both obviously can chime in. How did you get comfortable figuring out your voice in the podcast while still trying to be authentic?
Well, the cool thing about our podcast is that I'm a former player, basketball junkie. Then Tarika, who's, our producer and co-host, is a basketball fan, comes from a more general perspective. So we have good balance there. But to me, it's just an extension of who you already are. Like I try to say, when people say, how do I find my voice? You already have one. You just come in, for me as an analyst, as someone who's naturally curious, so I'm going to ask questions. I'm always talking about the culture. So it's more about just being who you are, and the more comfortable you are with that process, even outside your podcast, just in general, the easier it's going to be. But I think you also find your voice in what you decide to highlight, like your content. Like that's your voice too. So it's not just in what you're saying, but the topics that you choose to discuss. Give people some insight into who you are, what you're passionate about, and that's all who you are authentically.
Bingo, nailed it. I mean, you nailed it. The podcast space was probably so special to me too, because it was one of those places where I didn't get pulled to the side and was told to rein it in. It was okay. It's my space. Like it's my space. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, and you guys know, you're Black women in this industry. Like, it's been a minute before you would see somebody on TV with my hair in my position. Like, there's a whole bunch of stuff that comes with the industry. But the podcast thing was literally my space. Like, when I was recruited to the team, they was like, yo, like, we want you to do this your way. And it was so funny because when we made the image for my pod, again, we're all into the same network, but we went with green and blue, and like the graphics guys drew it, and they sent it back, y'all, and they had jacked up my hoop earrings. And I was like, okay, this is great, but the earrings should look more like this than this. But like, that was something that mattered to me, and being represented in this space as I am. And so I'm loving my team. Shout out to my squad.
Yeah, it's hard not to be authentic in the podcast space because it's an intimate environment, and you really most times are creating it from some inner passion that you have. So I would say from the gate, be yourself. You're not going to really get anywhere, whether that be podcasting, TV, radio, it doesn't matter the medium. You're never going to get anywhere trying to imitate somebody else. Yeah. You're just going to be a cheap knockoff. So you better off just presenting who you are. And if people like it, great. And if they don't, you got to be cool with that part too. Not that they wouldn't, but if they don't, at least you can have some comfort in knowing that you did it on your own terms. Yep. So I think that part is really important. And honestly, podcasting, because of the environment of podcasting, it helped me strengthen my voice because you are in a relaxed environment. You can pretty much, even when I was at ESPN, I mean, we used to curse all the time. They just had to bleep it. That was the difference. They just had to bleep it. That was all. But it was still very helpful just in my growth as a commentator. All right, so we got another question here. Kenneth Lee says, I've been brainstorming with a group of my friends from Tuskegee about doing a podcast. I was wondering, what are some of your recommendations for doing a remote show?
So we actually do, we've done live shows at the last 2 Final Fours. And basically, I mean, it really worked because of the partnership with the NCAA. It wasn't really us. Like, they have a kind of festival thing they do already at the Final Four where fans come in. It's like a fan fest. So they basically have a stage that's already there where they have programming going, and they just plugged us in. So people are walking by, but also obviously we're promoting leading up to it. And it's been great. Like, honestly, it's been one of my favorite parts. Like, I think we got 300 at our last live podcast. And it's just like, you get to interact with the fans and hear from them. And, you know, some of them are just walking by and they're like, oh, what is this? They come in and then they become fans of the podcast. So, you know, that's been the best part. We also did one at a Connecticut Sun game when Lindsay Whalen was getting her jersey retired. So that was awesome because we sat down with Lindsay and a bunch of people. So we want to do more of those live shows, but that's my small experience in that space so far.
Yeah, and then I guess I did one. The live one that I did was at Essence Fest, and that was a lot of fun to do that one with Kamala Harris. And it is a lot different when you're doing a podcast and a live event, as you know, LaChina. So you kind of have to prepare for all scenarios. But main thing, make sure the audio is tight.
Yep.
Okay. Technically, make sure you are sound. That's like number one. I don't care if you got to go through it 11 times. Go through it 11 times because you don't want that breakdown to happen when you're in the midst of doing a podcast. Now, they did not specify if they meant remote as an event or if they meant remote as in me and my friends, are across the country and we're trying to do that. Clearly,
okay.
I didn't know which one they meant. I was like, which one do they mean here? But to cover the other one, clearly Zoom is a great tool.
Yeah.
And I agree with something LaChina said earlier. If you're able to make sure that you guys can see each other, that's how you don't get the awkward pauses, talking over each other, that kind of thing. You can visually take cues so that people don't even know you're not in the same room. Yeah. So did you have anything that you wanted to add to that, Monica?
Yeah, Zoom is a great, we used Uber Conference. I don't know if people know that one as much, but that one's good too. And then
now does Uber Conference, is that video as well?
You can do video. You can do video, or you can just latch in through your landlines. And then I think if you're going from regular podcasting to like a remote event, just be mindful if you're not used to doing stuff in front of an audience, because that can be like a little different.
I think LaChina went to get a drink. No, I'm just kidding.
She had to show off her legs, girl.
I see. Well, here's another good question that came from the chat. How do you all go about finding content while sports are not currently being played? Monica, you want to take that one?
Yeah, like we're all over The Last Dance right now. Like DA was talking about all of his different, his 2-hour-long and some change interview session for the doc itself, and then now how it's been played out as it's re-airing. This Friday, shout out to the DMV, Kevin Durant's picture in the water, or documentary rather, in the water is coming out. So we're trying to track down somebody from that. I'm all with like what we're doing, what we're talking about.
What about you, LaChina? How have I know you said you take a natural break, but
yeah, we're on break, but I just think it's whatever's hot, you know, whatever's interesting to you. You know, that's the biggest thing, is follow your interests.
Yeah, I'm not really the person to ask this question because I do not have a sports podcast. Some sports happens to show up sometimes, so I have a little bit more to play with than if you did. But I still think even if I had a sports podcast, there'd be plenty to talk about. I mean, I guess this is sort of a free plug wrapped around what could be a potential topic. The documentary by Quibi on the Los Angeles Clippers, which I'm in. And it has all the players, Matt Barnes, Chris Paul, everybody, Doc Rivers, all of them are in it, you know, because of this content, this thirst for content, that you're going to see a lot of sports stuff put out. And that's going to, like, you know, The Last Dance, that's going to lead to you being able to fuel some conversations. And don't be afraid to create some conversations too. I mean, how sports adapts to this pandemic is just a constant conversation. I mean, you have Major League Baseball talking about they coming back in July. It's like a whole bunch of stuff, you know, that's happening. And even if you wanted to, one thing we were really, really good at with his and hers is using sports to make an entry point into a national conversation. You saw what LeBron James had to say about Ahmaud Arbery. Use LeBron James to talk about that if you want to discuss that case and what happened there. So there's just little things you can do to piggyback off some of the conversations that athletes themselves are having. Another question that we have from the chat is, as African Americans, we are often asked not to be, quote, too ratchet, or we're told to be professional? How do you distinguish between being professional, politically correct, while still being Black, all caps?
Black.
All caps. I guess, you know what, for me, I've never separated them personally.
I was just about to say that.
I just haven't. I just haven't.
Who you are, like, that's the best advice I could really give, honestly. Like,
so I will say this. And it's funny, Christine Williamson, who is now a talent at ESPN, y'all should check her out, she's dope, is bald, right? And then there's me, right? And like, I guess I have been challenged more in my presentation of Blackness than my character as a Black person. So I don't ever feel like I had to separate Monica McNutt, African-American woman. Like, I don't think I've ever had to separate that. In fact, if I'm honest, in terms of being coached through the course of my career, some of it was just a professional level, like what was deemed what we're used to seeing on television versus me doing all this, like on occasions, right? But I think my presentation has probably been the only pushback that I've gotten. And I decided a long time ago, like, my hair is the way I want it to be because it's about more than just this. Like, this is my quality of life, being able to work out, like, and this is not going to change it. So if it means my path winds a little bit more, then cool. But here we are, so I'm all right.
And shout out to NABJ, because I actually remember a conversation I had with Monica when she was first getting into it. She came up to me and asked me about her hair.
Mm-hmm.
She was like, so what do you think about my hair? You know, what do you think people are going to think about it? I was like, listen, this is the advice I always give. It's your job to show up in the skin in which you are most comfortable, because that's going to allow you to do the best job that you can do, right? So whatever that skin looks like for you, that's what you show up to do. If I show up and try to look like somebody else, I'm not going to feel like LaChina, which means you're not going to get LaChina. And so the best thing you could do is be in touch with what version of you, whether it's what you say or what you look like, that makes you feel closest to who you really are. And that is going to be your authentic voice.
Yep.
I would say whether we're talking about, you know, how you are on air or what you look like. You know, I got braids, so I understand, you know, I never at one time gave any thought to changing up just because it might make somebody whose opinion I probably don't care about comfortable.
And we wear braids. You wore braids, Jemele.
Braids.
Okay?
I don't have braids, but I got y'all.
That's all good. But these are the pressures that you obviously face, especially as you vacillate between being on air and podcasting is different, even though it can be a visual medium. But I would say wherever you work, you could be at a small network, have a podcast that has 10 listeners, 100 or 100,000. Know who you are before you start.
Yep.
That's the major key. Know who you are before you start, because if you do, there will be certain compromises you just won't make. And it won't really matter what's at stake or what you can benefit if you do make those compromises. If you don't, I used to say this to people who came to ESPN, particularly if they were younger, like, you got to know who you are before you walk in this building. Because if you don't, then that's going to be much more of a downfall for you than anything else that could happen here. And so you have that strong sense of self. And I think you'll know when somebody's asking you to compromise a little bit too much of who you are. All right, back to some more questions. Angel Gray.
Hey, girl.
What up? So Angel has asked, how do you decide which guests to have on, and how do you pick between what's interesting to you versus what you think the masses are interested in? LaChina, you got any tease on that?
Yeah, I mean, because we're not really interested in clicks, you know, that's not really of course we want to grow our listeners, but because that doesn't drive it, we're not necessarily worried about what everybody else wants to hear. We try to stay in touch with what's happening on the landscape that's interesting to us. So I don't know if that's helpful at all, but again, just going back to what I said previously in women's basketball, you know, we're trying to cover NCAA, WNBA, grassroots, AAU, like, we're trying to cover all levels. So there's always something happening. But it is a podcast that's based around what's hot.
I think it could be like the clickiest thing or whatever, but if I don't care, like, the pod is not going to bring my energy. And as we all discussed, we're doing this from a place of passion. Like, I just want pods that I'm proud of. Like, and if it happens to be on trend, then bet. But if it happens to be something that I hope somebody discovers randomly and at least gets them thinking, then bet. That's good too.
One thing I decided, not just with this podcast, but it applies more so to this podcast because it is so guest driven. I'm not gonna give an audience to stupid. I'm just not. And by stupid, I don't mean, there's a lot of people who are okay with doing confrontational, television, confrontational podcasting, having people on. It's okay. I'm not saying that everybody has to agree with me. That's not what this is about. But if I fundamentally find you to be repulsive, I'm not having you on. And so, no, I'm not debating Candace Owens. Sorry. That's just not happening. That's just it. Like, it's just certain people that just will never make it. And if that's the case, that's the case. Because you can definitely know the difference between the people who are in it for real versus the people who just want to use your platform to jumpstart something for them.
Yep.
And those people will never see the light of day on my podcast. And I don't like that train wreck, media of like people passing around viral clips of me yelling at somebody. Like, that doesn't do anything, for me. So we don't have to agree at all. I'm okay with a divergence of opinions, but I need authenticity. I need you to be real about it and not be in it for a grift. And that doesn't just apply to her. That was just the example that I kind of first thought of because people constantly ask me that question. And there's this whole other thing where just the blackness in me just ain't really trying to be doing this black public cat fight just for the sake of white entertainment, but we can go on.
Yeah, we got it.
We can go on. So,
we received.
Yes. But I definitely think that it's okay. Like sometimes I found this out. When I did a list or when we compiled what was our top rated podcast, you'd be shocked at people love good stories. They like people who have something compelling and interesting to say. I ain't turning down Michelle Obama, okay? That's not it. But what I am saying is that there are people, you both talked about it, that you feel like have a point of view, something to say, and it's important that you give them a platform. So I think that covers it just as well. Okay, I think this is a good question. This may be our final question, is how do you balance not getting paid much for something you're passionate about and sustaining yourself financially? She's like, I'm still trying to think.
Like, yeah, look, all right, so I'm gonna go first because I'm probably the closest to whoever asked that question. This is not my main gig, right? Like, millennials, I don't know if you want to blame it on millennials or whatever, but like the multiple streams.
Are you a millennial? I think you too young to be a millennial.
Oh, young. Look, I know I got this young face, but I'm a whole 30. Like, I'm 30.
Okay. Oh, is that a millennial?
Yeah, I'm straight a millennial, y'all.
Okay, I get it.
Anyway,
all right, go
multiple streams. My podcast is obviously, like, that's not a revenue generator per se. I think the side hustle, like, and I hear those folks that argue that we should go back to a place where we just had habits and they were things that we enjoyed. And maybe you can look at your podcast as a habit, something that you enjoy. And it also is a side hustle. So I think, like, you got to figure out a way to make it work. And maybe at that point in your life, it's not something you do every week. Maybe you do it bi-weekly. Maybe you do it once a month. You figure out what works for you, but you got to, like, again, be true to the game, start it, and be consistent with it.
Yeah, I mean, Monica said it perfectly. And I just think knowing, we all have different passions, but you got to know those that have a market and those that don't, right? So that's why you might have a nonprofit and you might have a side gig and then you might have a full-time job. Like, all of your passions may not make you money right away, and Jemele spoke to this earlier, like, eventually podcasting could do that for you. But if you're passionate about it, you're going to get a fulfillment. I mean, money isn't hopefully the only thing that makes you feel fulfilled. So if you're doing your podcasting and you're covering a topic that means a lot to you, or you're, doing something that's authentically making you feel good, like, that's worth something, especially in today's world. Because I know a lot of people making money off of stuff that they're not feeling good about. So you got to decide, what the market is, and then what your passions are, what your interests are, and which ones you can make money off of and which ones you can't, but it may not be podcasting right away, which means you might have to get a side job in Wendy's for now until your podcast gets popping off. And then
main job. And
right.
It's your side job.
Exactly. And if you do get that job at Wendy's, hook me up with some spicy chicken nuggets because they undefeated.
You don't know they got a birthday cake frosty now. I don't know if you knew that. Yes.
LaChina.
Hey, I don't know what y'all got on the West Coast.
Okay, that's gonna be my major takeaway. They have a birthday cake flavored frosty.
Yes,
I'm in.
Yes.
If the frosty machine ever works, although no, that's McDonald's. That's McDonald's. That's where the ice cream machine don't ever work.
Wendy's be down too. Wendy's be down.
What I would say is that I think we assume that if we're not making money from it, we're not growing. As I told the story earlier, doing the His and Hers podcast for free led to it becoming a TV show. That was nothing that we saw. That was nothing that we envisioned, but it was a result of us pouring our passion, time, energy, commitment into something, even though we had nothing to show for it and weren't getting any money from it. And if not for that, I don't get to hear. And so you have to sort of see everything as a stair-step kind of process. Is that even, and Monica and LaChina both talked about it. LaChina, despite the fact that it may not be putting any tangible money in her pocket, she is learning her versatility as an analyst, host, and interviewee. Now that's an interviewer. Now that's something she can flip on her resume, or that's another tool she has in her tool belt because she's doing it all the time with podcasting. Same thing with Monica, being able to grow into her voice and find her lane and do all these other things because she's getting the reps. It's the reps that matter the most, especially as you're emerging and growing and you're just starting off. It's like, you know, I tell a lot of the younger journalists, look, I know I'm coming from a privileged position. Like, it's real easy for me to tell you to turn down some money or not to worry about making money or whatever. But I promise you, especially early on, if you think development first, that will get you that paycheck that you're looking for. I mean, I always believe that if you're good at it, you're going to make money. You're going to make money. And the way you get good at it is that you got to do it repeatedly over and over and over again so that you understand who you are in this medium and what you bring to the table. So the more times you do it, the better you'll get at it. I promise you. Anyway, ladies, this was food for my soul. Yeah, for sure. I don't get to talk to you often. I see us, we passing ships on social media. And so, you know, this was really great and excellent. I'm sure everybody out there enjoyed it too. Only thing missing was some wine. You know, had LaChina went and got a drink, I'd have been like, see this Crown Royal. But anyway.
Right here, I got this white Hennessy. I have not cracked.
You got that island joint.
White Hennessy. See, she don't even talk about me, talking about something. I mean, I know we ain't got it like you. Ma'am, you have white Hennessy. Stop it.
Hey, I've had this thing for about 2 years and ain't cracking it. Once you get that bottle of white Hennessy, you got to hold on to it for a special occasion.
That's right.
You don't know when
especially in COVID. We don't know the next time we're going to travel to get it. So we'll be good. But anyway, thank you all out there for listening.
Thank you, Jemele. Yes. Thank you, LaChina.
Yeah. And thank you, Sherrod, for putting this together.
Yes,
for sure.
Thanks, Monica.
All right. Bye, y'all.
Thank you guys for doing this. I appreciate it. Just quick shout out, Jemele, Monica, LaChina. Thank you so much for doing this. This has been amazing. And I do want some of that white Hennessy. I'm going to lie.
See, now we all know where to get it.
We'll talk a little bit later about that. But again, wanted to say thank you, ladies, for doing this. And also just to let folks know that this is the first in our series of Innovation in Isolation. We're going to talk about social media. Next week, we're going to also get into the art of storytelling. We're on this month as well. But we wanted to kick it off with something special, something hot, something banging. Jemele, Monica, LaChina, way to bring it. Before I leave, before we go out, just want to give a special shout out to Taria Williams from Turner, who was a big part of helping put this together and organize this. So that's my VP on the NABJ Sports Task Force board. She did an awesome job. And again, thank you all for tuning in. And we'll have some of this information up later on YouTube and all that stuff. So be on the lookout for that. And that's all I got. I wish I had some white Hennessy, but that's all I got.
All right, guys. Y'all stay safe.
Bye, y'all. Stay safe.
Be good, folks.